A precise meaning for a predicate classifies every object in the universe as satisfying or not satisfying the predicate. In the real world of language use, predicates are rarely precise in this sense. Predicate words in natural languages are almost always vague. What this means is that one can find intermediate cases where it is unclear whether or not the predicate applies. This situation is classically described with the paradox of the heap. Imagine a heap of sand. Imagine the process of removing sand from the heap, one grain at a time, going on indefinitely until no sand remains where the heap was. At some point, one no longer has a heap of sand. This point is probably reached before the sand is entirely gone. For example, 1 grain of sand is probably not a heap. 2 grains of sand is probably not a heap. If it's unclear whether or not 137 grains of sand in a pile should be called a heap of sand, then such a collection of sand grains is an intermediate case of the predicate is a heap. Maybe it's clear to you that 137 grains of sand is, or is not, on the other hand, a heap. What about 2 grains? What about 7? What about 500? Whatever your intuitions about heaps are, I imagine it's clear that there are numbers of sand grains which, when piled together, create intermediate cases for the predicate is a heap, where it's not obvious whether or not to call those collections of sand grains heaps. If is a heap is a precise predicate, then at some point removing a single grain of sand from the heap must cause us to pass from having a heap of sand to not having a heap of sand. However, it seems intuitive that a single grain of sand cannot make the difference between having a heap of sand and not having a heap of sand. The usual conclusion is that is a heap is a vague predicate. Is a heap is somehow different from a precise predicate, in such a way that some objects are neither discernibly heaps nor discernibly non-heaps. There are many different theories of what it means for a predicate to be vague, and of how to make sense of vague predicates and their seemingly paradoxical nature. Phil Papers has cataloged over 1,000 scholarly works on vagueness and indeterminacy. The academic debate around vagueness is, as you might guess, stunningly intricate and complicated. I don't propose to provide a theory of vague predicates in this work. I don't think one needs a theory of vague predicates in order to make effective use of them in arguments or in life in general. For the purposes of the present argument for the correctness of the rules of classical logic, the challenge posed by vagueness is that it challenges the applicability of the rules of classical logic to real-world problems. A sequence is valid according to classical logic if and only if it has no precise counterexamples. The existence of vagueness and other forms of non-preciseness in real predicates might make us wonder, are there invalid argument forms which lack any precise counterexamples, or valid argument forms which have precise counterexamples? If so, then the rules of classical logic are not necessarily correct in all cases. We can quickly rule out the possibility of valid argument forms which have precise counterexamples. An argument form with precise counterexamples has convincing counterexamples, and so it is not valid. Here, I am using valid in the sense of valid for people in general explained earlier. I am using counterexample in the sense of a person, a hypothetical or real truth-seeking debate context, and an instance of the argument form, where the person would generally consider the premises warranted assertable and the conclusion not warranted assertable. I am using convincing counterexample in the sense of a counterexample which generalizes to people in general, meaning that the debate context and the argument will form a counterexample for more or less anybody, given sufficient time, attention, openness to the process of truth-seeking debate, etc. I take it to be true by the definitions of these terms that if an argument form has a convincing counterexample, then it is not valid. I am using precise counterexample in the sense of a counterexample where the terms in the argument have precise meanings, the premises of the argument are true, and the conclusion is false. To recall, I was just unpacking the terms in a sentence, a one-sentence argument, and here is that argument again. An argument form with precise counterexamples has convincing counterexamples, and so it is not valid. The one-sentence argument just given, for the conclusion that there are no valid argument forms with precise counterexamples, relies on the assumption that every precise counterexample is a convincing counterexample. This assumption is intuitively plausible, but I have not argued for it yet. My argument for the assumption is that, as far as I am aware, when it comes to practical applications of logic, there are no convincing counterexamples to the assumption that every precise counterexample is a convincing counterexample. If given such a counterexample, then I would need to reevaluate my position. I haven't come across one, and I can't conceive of one, but I don't rule out the possibility of one existing. That completes my argument that there are no valid argument forms with precise counterexamples. It is not a watertight argument, to be sure. This doesn't bother me very much, for the reason that I don't consider it possible to give a watertight argument for the correctness of a set of rules of logic. One reason for this is that, as far as I can tell, any argument for the correctness of a set of rules of logic must employ rules of logic. I have been employing the rules of classical logic all throughout this argument for the correctness of the rules of classical logic, mostly implicitly, but all over the place. And for example, in order to derive from the axioms of ZFC the mathematical facts that I have used in the argument, such as the soundness and completeness theorems. In some sense, any argument for the correctness of a system of rules of logic will be circular, since it will almost inevitably employ the rules of logic it is trying to justify. This is an interesting paradox. It would be a problem for my view if my present goal was to establish knowledge of the correctness of the rules of logic. However, my goal is merely to justify the idea that the rules of classical logic are correct from a pragmatic standpoint, in particular, that using the rules of inference of classical logic will not lead us into some kind of pragmatic error, that they will not in practice lead us from truth into falsehood, and that these rules can safely and generally be employed in the practice of constructing winning arguments. I am comfortable that I can safely and reasonably use classical logic in the course of making this argument for the following reasons. Though I don't think I know anything about the world outside my own consciousness, I operate in the context of a subjective series of experiences affected by a reality that is hostile in many ways to my existence and my goals. I am aware of many risks and problems, and many ways of dealing with them. I am able to accomplish a great deal in the world, and to do so with a degree of dependability that inspires people to rely on me for important tasks. Logic is my most central tool, and certainly my most reliable cognitive tool, for accomplishing this. More generally, my cognition is a tool that is part of my being, which I use to do work. In the present context, I am applying my cognition to do the work of introspecting on my methods of cognition and investigating their reliability for the purposes of doing any kind of work. I am employing logic in this work, as I would with any other work where logic could help me to progress. It is a possible outcome of the investigation that logical principles which I currently deem to be reliable are shown to be unreliable for some purposes. In such an event, I would change my views about what rules of logic are reliable according to what was shown. Until that happens, however, I have no hesitation about using the rules of logic that I ordinarily believe and assume to be reliable, namely, the rules of classical logic, in the course of the investigation. My views about the rules of logic are in a state of reflective equilibrium. Earlier, I raised two questions expressing doubts about the correctness of the rules of classical logic. These questions are pertinent, even if we accept the conclusion I arrived at, that a sequence is valid according to classical logic, if and only if it lacks precise counterexamples. The first question was whether there are any valid argument forms with precise counterexamples. And I answered no to this question. And the second question is whether there are invalid argument forms which lack precise counterexamples. This is a trickier question. Whether or not such an argument form exists is a primary and crucial topic of debate between believers in classical logic and believers in non-classical logics. Because this is such a complex and contentious debate, I do not harbor the ambition to resolve the debate in this text. What I will do is offer the best argument I can, to the effect that every invalid argument form has a precise counterexample, and that from a pragmatic standpoint we can safely operate under this assumption. I want to argue that there are no pragmatically convincing counterexamples to the claim that every invalid argument form has a precise counterexample. Stated differently, the claim is that there is no real-world context where practical problems would arise from assuming that some argument form with no precise counterexamples is valid. My basis for this claim is that I have looked for such pragmatically convincing counterexamples without finding them. I will illustrate the difficulty of finding such pragmatically convincing counterexamples by exploring some avenues for producing such counterexamples that may seem promising, and explaining why it seems to me that those avenues yield no such counterexamples. Let us first consider the topic of vagueness. Can vague predicates provide us with any pragmatically convincing examples of invalid argument forms with no precise counterexamples? Let's start with a very simple example. The argument form, nothing, entails A or not A. This argument form has an empty sequence of premises and a single conclusion. All instances of this argument form are a valid sequence according to classical logic. According to classical logic, for any statement A, either A is true, or its negation, not A, is true. According to classical logic, an equivalent way of stating this is to say that for any statement A, either A is true or A is false. This principle is sometimes called the law of the excluded middle, or LEM for short. Many proponents of non-classical logics reject the law of the excluded middle. Many also reject the idea that all of the formulations of LEM given in the previous paragraph are equivalent statements. The main question for our purposes is, are there any pragmatically convincing counterexamples to LEM? Vague predicates provide a potentially promising avenue for finding pragmatically convincing counterexamples to LEM. All we need to do is to find a pragmatic context where, assuming for a specific statement A that the statement A or not A is true, will lead us into some kind of pragmatic error. Note that it is not sufficient to find a case where philosophical reflection tells us that a statement is, intuitively speaking, neither true nor false. Such cases, one might argue, are easy to find by considering intermediate cases of vague predicates. For example, is a human male tall if they are exactly the average height of a human male plus an inch, or plus a half inch, or a quarter inch, and so forth on to infinity? So you might think that somewhere along in that sequence, it becomes unclear whether such a person should be called tall, or maybe it's unclear whether a person of exactly average height should be called tall. So an example such as this one does not by itself meet the burden of proof I have defined for the non-classical logician. We need a case where there is something erroneous about assuming that the statement A or not A is true, and the error could matter for some practical purpose. Suppose one needs to classify human males as tall or not tall for some practical purpose. For example, suppose we are trying to select players for a men's basketball team, and we are trying to follow the rule that we will only select players who are tall. Or, one can suppose that we are recruiting male soldiers for an elite division of an army, and that one of the physical requirements is that the recruits be tall. If one needs to classify human males as tall or not tall for some practical purpose, then in practice one will usually define a semi-arbitrary exact cutoff point, some height measurement x, stipulating that all males of height less than x are not tall for the purpose, and all males of height more than x are tall for the purpose. If one encountered a male whose height was exactly x, to within the limits of the precision of the measuring apparatus, then one would semi-arbitrarily make a decision as to whether or not they count as tall, for whatever purpose is at hand. The generalization of these comments is that in practical contexts, when one is dealing with vague predicates, e.g. tall, intermediate cases are handled, usually, by semi-arbitrarily classifying the object as satisfying or not satisfying the predicate in question. In contexts where this is the rule, we can think of vague predicates as being incomplete precise predicates, whose definitions are extended on an ad hoc basis to deal with intermediate cases as they arise. So let's think about pragmatic situations where one encounters an intermediate case of a vague predicate, and one's response is not to classify the object as satisfying or not satisfying the predicate. In such situations, the pragmatics of the situation do not require one to classify the object as satisfying or not satisfying the predicate. Instead, one is somehow able to work around making such a classification. Such cases will only pose a problem for the argument I am making if it can be shown that classifying the object as satisfying or not satisfying the predicate would lead to some form of pragmatically significant error. I haven't come up with any such examples. I am interested if you have any. And for the time being, I operate under the assumption that there are none. I will assume going forward in the argument that there are no pragmatic situations where classifying an object as satisfying or not satisfying a vague predicate will lead to some form of pragmatically significant error, regardless of which of the two classification options is chosen. If this assumption holds, then it rules out vagueness as a source of pragmatically convincing counterexamples to the claim that every invalid argument has a precise counterexample. This is because, if one has a vague counterexample to an invalid argument form, one can, in principle, turn it into a precise counterexample by filling in all details of the vague predicates and copulas, classifying every object or pair of objects in the domain/universe as satisfying or not satisfying each predicate or copula, right? So basically what I'm getting at here is when it comes to vague predicates, they're vague, right? There are intermediate cases, but these don't constitute a problem for the law of the excluded middle, because you can always classify anything as belonging or not belonging to a category, right? Satisfying or not satisfying a vague predicate, for whatever purpose is at hand, right? Assuming, right, this is no guarantee that whatever word you're using is good for the purpose, right? So, for example, Well, so take right wing, right? So is someone either right wing or not, right? Well, I mean, no, like it's more complicated than that, I would say, right? Um, but like until but for the purposes of this argument, right, this argument is based on imposing this standard of proof, right, like pragmatically convincing counterexample. Like that's the kind of thing that I would care about, that in terms of like saying that the rules of classical logic are wrong, right? So for the kind of conclusion that I'm trying to advance, right, I'm just trying to say, right, there, or I just need that there are no pragmatically convincing counterexamples um, to the rules of classical logic, and I'm saying none come from vague predicates, because right, if you've got a vague predicate and you encounter an intermediate case, um, you can just sort it into one bin or the other, right? It is or it isn't, right? We're going to apply this word to this thing or not.